I thought kindness was supposed to make your life better, not turn it into something you couldn't recognize anymore. The night it all started, the rain wouldn't stop, the kind that hits your windshield so hard it sounds like static, like the world is trying to drown out your thoughts. And I remember gripping the steering wheel of my old Toyota, squinting through the blur of streetlights on Fifth Avenue, telling myself I just needed to get home. Just 10 more minutes, just one more mile. But then I saw him. He was standing near the curb, half in shadow, one hand pressed against his side like he was holding something together that wasn't supposed to be broken, and people were passing him like he wasn't even there, like he was just another piece of the city no one had time for. And I don't know why I slowed down. I don't know why I pulled over, because nothing about that moment was safe or smart. But something in the way he looked at the ground instead of at anyone else made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't ignore. I told myself it would take 2 minutes, maybe 3. I told myself I was just being a decent person, the kind my mom raised me to be, the kind who doesn't leave someone out in the cold when they clearly need help. So I grabbed the small first aid kit from my glove compartment and stepped out into the rain, my sneakers already soaked before I even reached him. And when I got close enough, he looked up at me like he didn't expect anyone to stop, like kindness was something foreign, something suspicious. And I remember forcing a small smile even though my heart was beating faster than it should have been. "Hey," I said, trying to sound steady, trying to pretend this was normal. "You okay?" He didn't answer right away, just studied me like he was trying to figure out my angle, like everyone always had one. And maybe they did, but I didn't. Not that night. Not yet. And eventually he nodded, barely, like it cost him something to admit it, and I knelt down anyway, opening the kit with hands that were starting to shake from the cold and something else I didn't want to name. I told him I was just going to help, that I wasn't going to call anyone unless he wanted me to, that I wasn't here to make things worse. And I kept talking because silence felt heavier than the rain, because if I stopped, I might realize how strange this was, how wrong it felt in a way I couldn't explain, and he let me help him, just enough to convince myself I'd done the right thing. Just enough to make me believe this was a small moment that would pass like everything else in this city. What I didn't see was the black car parked across the street, engine still running, windows dark enough to hide everything inside. And I definitely didn't see the man sitting in the back seat, watching every move I made. Not the stranger I was helping, just me. The way I hesitated before stepping closer, the way I didn't walk away when I should have, the way I chose kindness when it would have been easier to choose nothing at all. I thought I was helping a stranger that night, but I was wrong, because somewhere between the rain and that decision, someone else decided something about me, something I wouldn't understand until it was too late to go back. By the time I got back into my car, my hands would not stop shaking, not from the cold, not entirely, but from something I could not quite explain, like I had stepped slightly out of sync with my own life and had not found my way back yet. And I remember sitting there for a full minute with the engine running, watching the rain hit the hood in uneven patterns, telling myself it was over, that I had done what anyone decent would do and that was the end of it. But it did not feel like an ending. It felt like the beginning of something I had not agreed to. I drove the rest of the way home slower than usual, checking my mirrors more often than I needed to. Even though there was nothing there, no headlights following too close, no obvious signs of trouble, just the empty stretch of late-night traffic and the quiet hum of my tires on wet asphalt. And still, something sat heavy in my chest, like a warning I did not know how to read. My apartment was exactly the way I left it, small, warm, familiar, the kind of place that should have made everything feel normal again. But as soon as I locked the door behind me, the silence felt different, thicker somehow, like the walls were holding their breath, and I laughed at myself for even thinking that, because it sounded ridiculous, like I was turning one small decision into something dramatic, something it was not supposed to be. I changed out of my wet clothes, made a cup of tea I did not really want, and tried to scroll through my phone like any other night, but my mind kept drifting back to the look in his eyes, not fear exactly, not anger either, just something guarded, something that made me wonder what kind of life leaves a person standing alone in the rain like that, and why I felt like I had stepped into a story I did not understand. The next morning, I told myself everything would feel normal again, and for a while, it almost did. The routine of work, the noise of the city, the familiar faces that did not ask too many questions. But then little things started to shift in ways I could not ignore, subtle at first, The kind of details you might dismiss if you were not paying attention. Like the black sedan parked across the street from my building when I left for work. Still there when I came back 8 hours later. Engine off, but presence unmistakable. Or the way my usual coffee order was already waiting for me at the counter even though I had not placed it yet. The barista smiling like it was nothing, like someone had simply paid ahead. And when I asked who, she just shrugged and said a man in a suit, which could have meant anyone in this city, except it did not feel like anyone. It felt specific. I tried to ignore it. I really did. Told myself coincidences happen all the time, that I was connecting dots that were not there. But then my landlord called that afternoon, his tone suddenly polite in a way it had never been before, telling me my lease had been extended at a lower rate without me even asking. And when I pressed him on it, he hesitated just long enough to confirm what I was already starting to suspect, that someone had spoken to him, someone with influence, someone who did not need to explain themselves. That was the moment the unease settled into something solid, something real. And for the first time, I thought about that car again, the one I never noticed, the one that had been there all along. And I realized with a clarity that made my pulse spike that night had not ended when I drove away. It had followed me home. It had stepped quietly into my life without knocking. And whoever was behind it had already decided something about me without ever asking if I wanted any part of it. I told myself I needed proof before I let fear take over, something real, something undeniable. Because up until that point, everything could still be explained away if I tried hard enough. Coincidence stacked on coincidence. A story my mind was building because it needed answers. But that illusion cracked the moment I saw him in daylight. It was just past noon, the city loud and ordinary in the way it always is, taxis honking, people rushing past without looking at each other. And I was standing in line at a small deli a few blocks from work, trying to focus on something simple like ordering lunch, when the room shifted in a way that had nothing to do with sound. It was subtle at first, the way conversations softened just slightly, the way the man behind the counter straightened his posture without knowing why, the way space opened up near the entrance like people instinctively made room for something they could not name. And then I saw him. He did not rush, did not look around, did not need to. He moved like everything around him already belonged to him, like the world adjusted itself without being asked. And there was nothing exaggerated about him. No raised voice, no dramatic presence, just control, quiet and absolute. And somehow that was worse. He was dressed simply, dark jacket, clean lines, nothing flashy, but everything about him felt deliberate, chosen. And when his eyes lifted, they did not scan the room. They landed directly, like he already knew where to look, like he had been looking long before I noticed him. My breath caught in a way that made no sense, because I had never seen him before. Not like this, not clearly, and yet something inside me reacted like recognition without memory. He walked past the line, no one stopping him, no one questioning it, and for a second I thought he would leave, that I was imagining the connection entirely, but then he stopped right beside me. Not in front, not behind, beside, close enough that I could feel the shift in air, close enough that I became aware of every small detail. The faint scent of something expensive but restrained, the calm way he stood, hands relaxed, posture easy, like he had all the time in the world and none of it could be taken from him. "You should be more careful," he said, voice low, steady, the kind that does not need volume to be heard. And it took me a second to realize he was speaking to me, because people like him do not just speak to people like me, not without a reason. "Excuse me," I asked, hating the way my voice sounded smaller than I intended, but he did not react to that, did not smile, did not soften, just watched me in a way that felt like he was measuring something I could not see. "Helping strangers in this city," he continued, like we were already in the middle of a conversation I did not remember starting. "It does not always end the way you expect." The words settled into me slowly, heavy and precise, and suddenly the rain, the street, the man I had helped, all of it rushed back at once, sharper now, more real, and I felt my pulse pick up as understanding began to form in pieces I did not want to put together. "How do you know about that?" I asked, and for the first time, something almost like interest flickered in his expression, subtle, but there, like I had finally said something worth acknowledging. He did not answer right away, just held my gaze long enough that looking away felt like losing something I did not understand. And then he said, "Because I was there," like it was the simplest thing in the world, like it explained everything, even though it only made things worse. I stared at him, trying to reconcile the calm man standing in front of me with the feeling that had been building since that night, the sense that something had been watching, waiting, deciding, and before I could ask anything else, before I could decide whether to step back or demand more answers, he added, almost as an afterthought, "And now, so am I." And just like that, the ordinary world around me did not feel ordinary anymore, because I finally understood that this was not something that had happened to me by accident. This was something that had chosen me, and he was standing right in front of me as proof. My first instinct was to walk away, to pretend I had not heard him, not understood him, to step out of whatever this was before it pulled me in any deeper, but my feet did not move, and I hated that more than anything, because it felt like my own body had decided something before my mind could catch up. "You were there," I repeated, slower this time, like saying it differently might make it less real, but he just watched me with that same steady focus, like my reaction was exactly what he expected, like none of this surprised him at all. "You saw everything," I added, and this time it was not a question, it was a realization settling into place piece by piece, and the weight of it made the room feel smaller, the noise of the deli fading into something distant and irrelevant. He nodded once, a small, controlled movement, and somehow that was worse than if he had tried to explain, worse than if he had denied it, because it confirmed what I was starting to understand, that nothing about that night had been random, not the man on the street, not my decision to stop, not even the feeling that something was off, like I had stepped into a situation already in motion. "Why didn't you help him?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, sharp with something I did not bother to hide. Because if he had been there, if he had seen what I saw, then he had made a choice too, and I needed to know what kind of person makes that choice. For the first time, there was a pause, not long, but noticeable, like I had touched on something that required a different kind of answer, and when he spoke again, his voice did not change, still calm, still controlled, but there was something underneath it now, something colder. "Because he was not the one who mattered," he said, and the simplicity of it made my stomach tighten, because he said it like it was obvious, like the world naturally sorted people into categories that determined who was worth attention and who was not, and I did not know where that left me, except that I was suddenly very aware that I had been seen, evaluated, and somehow chosen without my consent. "That does not make any sense," I said, shaking my head slightly, trying to push back against the logic I did not want to accept, but he did not argue, did not defend himself, just took a small step closer, not enough to invade my space, but enough to make the distance between us feel intentional, measured. "It does," he replied quietly. "You just do not understand it yet." And there it was again, that assumption, that certainty that this was something I would eventually see the way he did, and it irritated me more than it should have, because I did not want to be part of whatever system he operated in, did not want to be someone who could be categorized that easily. "Then explain it to me," I said, crossing my arms in a small act of defiance that felt insignificant compared to the way he stood there, completely at ease, completely in control, and for a second, I thought he might actually answer, might give me something concrete to hold on to, but instead, he glanced toward the counter, then back at me, like he had already calculated how much time this interaction deserved. "You made a decision that night," he said, "one most people would not have made, and decisions like that have consequences." And I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it sounded like something out of a warning I had ignored my entire life. Except this time it did not feel abstract. It felt personal, immediate. "Helping someone is not supposed to come with consequences like this," I replied, my voice lower now, more controlled, because if he could remain calm, so could I, even if my heart was still beating too fast. "That depends on who is watching," he said, and the words settled between us in a way that made everything else fall into place, the car, the changes, the feeling of being observed without seeing anyone. And suddenly I understood that this was not about the man I helped, not really. It was about him, about the fact that he had been there, that he had seen something in that moment that I could not see myself. And whatever that was, it had been enough to change the direction of my life without asking me if I wanted it changed at all. And as I stood there, trying to decide whether to push further or walk away, while I still could, I realized something else, something that made the unease settle deeper instead of fading. He was not here to threaten me, not directly, not in any way I could point to. He was here because he had already made a decision, and I was only just beginning to understand what that meant. I should have walked away right then, should have taken whatever warning he was offering and turned it into distance, into safety, into something that resembled control over my own life. But instead I stayed, because there was something about the way he spoke that made leaving feel less like a choice and more like avoidance, and I had never been good at pretending things were not happening when they clearly were. So what exactly are these consequences? I asked, forcing my voice to stay even though my thoughts were starting to move faster than I could organize them. Because if he had already decided something about me, then I needed to know what that meant before it unfolded without me. He studied me again, not in a way that felt invasive, but in a way that felt deliberate, like every reaction I had was being noted, understood, stored somewhere I could not access. And for a moment, I wondered how many people he had looked at this way, how many lives had shifted because he paid attention for just a little too long. Your world changes, he said simply, like it was a fact, not a threat, not even a warning, just something that happens the same way the weather changes or the seasons turn, inevitable and outside of your control. It already has, he added, and that was the part that made my chest tighten, because I could not deny it anymore, not after the car. The coffee, the lease, the quiet adjustments that had appeared without explanation, shaping my life into something slightly different than it had been before that night. You are the one doing that, I said, more certain now, the pieces finally aligning into something I could name, even if I did not fully understand it. And he did not deny it, did not correct me, just held my gaze like acknowledgement was enough. Why? The word came out sharper than I intended, but I did not take it back, because this was the question that mattered, the one that would decide whether this was something I could walk away from or something that had already gone too far. He exhaled slowly, not frustrated, not impatient, just measured, like even his pauses were controlled, and when he spoke again, his tone shifted just slightly, not softer, but more direct. Because you made a choice most people would not, he said, and I pay attention to choices like that. And I almost laughed again, because it still sounded abstract, still felt like an answer that explained everything and nothing at the same time. That is not a reason to interfere in someone's life, I replied, shaking my head, trying to push back against the calm certainty he carried so easily. But he did not react the way most people would, did not argue or raise his voice, just stepped a fraction closer, enough that I had to tilt my head slightly to maintain eye contact, enough that I became aware of how steady he was compared to how unsettled I felt. It is, if that life is now connected to mine, he said, and that was the first time something in his words felt like a line being drawn, something more defined than before, and I felt a flicker of something I did not want to name, something that was not fear exactly, but not comfort either. I did not agree to that, I said quickly, the response immediate, instinctive, because the idea that my life could be connected to his without my consent felt wrong on a level that went beyond logic, and for the first time, something almost like amusement touched his expression, subtle but there, like he had expected that answer all along. You did not have to, he replied, and the simplicity of it made my breath catch for just a second, because it confirmed what I had been trying not to accept since this conversation started, that whatever decision had been made, whatever direction my life had started to shift toward, it had not required my permission in the first place. I opened my mouth to respond, to argue, to say something that would re-establish some kind of boundary, but before I could, someone called his name from across the room, not loudly, not urgently, just enough to remind me that he did not exist in isolation, that there were other people, other forces, a larger world moving around him that I could not see clearly from where I stood. He glanced in that direction briefly, then back at me, and in that moment, I realized something else, something that made everything feel even more unbalanced. He was choosing to stay here, in this conversation, when he could have left at any time, and that choice, like everything else about him, felt intentional. This is not over, he said, not as a threat, not as a promise, just as a statement, like gravity or time, something that exists whether you acknowledge it or not. And before I could respond, before I could decide whether to follow him or walk away, he turned and moved toward the door, the space around him shifting again in that subtle, automatic way, leaving me standing there with the unmistakable realization that whatever had started that night had not reached its peak yet, not even close. And the most unsettling part was not that he had changed things around me. It was that part of me was starting to understand why. I told myself I was not going to think about him again, that whatever that conversation had been, whatever control he seemed to carry so effortlessly, it ended the moment he walked out of that deli. But the problem with telling yourself something like that is that it only works if the world cooperates, and mine clearly had other plans. The rest of the day felt slightly off, like everything was still where it should be, but not quite aligned the way I remembered. And I tried to focus on work, on emails, on the routine that usually grounded me, but my attention kept drifting, replaying every word he had said, every pause, every look, like there was something hidden in the spaces between that I had not fully understood yet. By the time I left the office, the sky had already turned that muted gray that comes just before evening settles in, and I remember checking my phone out of habit, half expecting something to be different even though I had no reason to think it would be. But there it was, a message from a number I did not recognize. No name, no introduction, just a single line that made my steps slow without me realizing it. You should not take the subway tonight. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, reading it twice, 3 times, like the meaning might shift if I looked at it differently. But it did not. It stayed exactly the same, calm, direct, and completely uninvited. And I did not need to ask who it was from, not really. Because there was only one person who spoke like that. Like suggestions were not suggestions at all. My first instinct was irritation, sharp and immediate, because the idea that he could just insert himself into my decisions like that felt like a line being crossed without permission, and I almost deleted the message right there, almost ignored it completely just to prove to myself that I still had control over something, anything. But then I hesitated, and that hesitation bothered me more than the message itself, because it meant part of me was already considering it, already adjusting. I looked up from my phone, scanning the street without meaning to, and everything seemed normal. People walking, cars passing, nothing out of place, and yet the feeling from the night before, that quiet sense of being observed, slipped back in like it had never left. I could take the subway. I told myself, there was no reason not to, it was what I always did, what made sense, what was practical, but his words lingered. Not urgent, not dramatic, just there, steady and impossible to ignore, and before I realized what I was doing, I turned toward the curb instead of the station entrance. This is ridiculous, I muttered under my breath, raising my hand to flag down a cab like I had done 100 times before. Except this time it did not feel routine. It felt like a choice I had not fully made on my own. The driver barely looked at me as I got in, asked for my address, and pulled away from the curb with the kind of indifference that usually comforted me, because it meant I was just another passenger in a city full of them. But as we moved through traffic, I found myself glancing at my phone again, half expecting another message, some confirmation, some explanation, but the screen stayed dark, silent, like whoever had sent that first line had already said everything they intended to say. The ride home was quiet, uneventful, and by the time I stepped out onto my street, I almost convinced myself I had overreacted, that nothing had changed, that I had simply chosen a different way to get home for no real reason. But then I saw it, parked across from my building again, the same black sedan, engine off, windows dark, exactly where it had been before, and this time, I did not try to explain it away, did not pretend it was coincidence, because I knew better now. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, keys in my hand, staring at that car like it might suddenly reveal something if I looked hard enough. And for the first time, the realization settled fully into place, not as a thought, not as a possibility, but as something solid and undeniable. I was no longer just living my life. I was being positioned inside someone else's. I did not go inside right away, which was not like me, because I have always been the kind of person who locks the door quickly, who values small routines that make the world feel predictable. But that night I stood there on the sidewalk with my keys in my hand, staring at that car like it might move if I challenged it long enough, like someone inside would step out and finally explain what was happening instead of letting me piece it together one quiet change at a time. The street was calm, almost too calm, the kind of stillness that makes every small sound feel amplified, the distant hum of traffic, the faint buzz of a streetlight overhead, and I became aware of how alone I was in that moment. Not just physically, but in the sense that whatever this was, whatever had started to shift around me, it was something no one else could see the way I did. I forced myself to move, to walk past the car without slowing down, without turning my head, because I refused to give it that kind of power, refused to let whoever was behind those dark windows see hesitation in me, even though my pulse was louder than the city for a few seconds. The building door closed behind me with a soft click that should have felt like relief, but it did not entirely, because the feeling followed me inside, up the stairs, down the hallway, all the way to my apartment like it had already learned how to move through my life without needing permission. I locked the door, checked it twice, then a third time, and leaned back against it for a second, closing my eyes like that might help me reset something, like I could draw a line between outside and inside, between whatever he controlled and whatever was still mine, but the line did not feel as clear as it used to. My phone buzzed again, and this time I did not hesitate before looking, because part of me already expected it, already knew who it would be before I even saw the screen. "You made the right choice," the message read, and I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, not because it reassured me, but because it confirmed everything I had been trying not to fully accept. I typed a response before I could overthink it, fingers moving faster than the caution I should have had. "Stop watching me." I stared at the words for a second, then hit send, the small act of defiance feeling bigger than it probably was, because it was the first time I had pushed back directly instead of just reacting. The reply came almost immediately, like he had been waiting, like there was no delay between my world and his. "I am not watching you," it said, and I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so clearly untrue that it felt like a statement with a different meaning hidden underneath. Before I could respond again, another message appeared. "I am making sure nothing happens to you." I stared at that line longer than the others, the words settling differently, heavier, more complicated, because they were not framed as control, not directly, but as protection, and that was somehow more unsettling, because it blurred the line I was trying to hold on to, the line between something I should fear and something I might start to rely on if I was not careful. I did not ask for that. I typed back, slower this time, more deliberate, because I needed him to understand that whatever he thought this was, it was not something I had agreed to, not something I wanted, not like this. The response took a few seconds longer, just enough to make me wonder if I had finally said something that required more than a simple answer. And when it came through, it was just one sentence, but it landed harder than anything else he had said so far. "You should not have to ask," it read, and I felt something shift again, not around me this time, but inside, because that was the first moment I realized this was not just about control, not just about decisions made without me. It was about the way he saw the world, the way he decided what was necessary and acted on it without hesitation, without doubt. And whether I liked it or not, I was already part of that system now, already someone he had decided was worth protecting, even if I had never asked him to. I did not sleep that night, not really, because every time I closed my eyes, the same thoughts circled back, not loud, not panicked, just persistent, like something settling into place whether I wanted it to or not. And by the time the sun started to rise, casting that pale light through my blinds, I realized this was no longer something I could ignore or pretend would fade on its own. I needed answers, not messages, not quiet adjustments to my life that I never agreed to, but real answers, the kind you get when you look someone in the eye and refuse to let them redirect the conversation. And for the first time since this started, I decided I was not going to wait for him to appear. I was going to find him. It sounded irrational the second I thought it, because people like him are not found, they decide, when they are seen. But there was a pattern now, something I could follow, and I held on to that like it was the only piece of control I had left. He had approached me in public, during the day, like it was nothing, like blending into my world required no effort at all, which meant he was closer than I wanted to believe, closer than someone like him should be. And if he was that confident, then maybe I could use that against him. Maybe I could force another meeting on my terms instead of waiting for his. I went to work like usual, but I paid attention differently, not just to my tasks, but to the space around me, the entrances, the people who came and went, the subtle shifts I had ignored before, and it did not take long to notice that same feeling again, that quiet change in the air, Not obvious enough for anyone else to react, but enough for me to recognize now that I knew what it meant. He was there before I saw him, just like before, and when I finally looked up from my desk, my eyes found him almost instantly, standing near the far end of the room like he had always been part of it, like he belonged in a place that did not match him at all. And for a second, I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the realization that this was happening because I had chosen it to, that I was stepping into whatever this was instead of being pulled along without understanding. I stood up before I could overthink it, my chair scraping slightly against the floor, louder than I intended, drawing a few glances I ignored, because none of that mattered right now, not compared to the way he watched me approach without moving, without reacting, like he had expected this outcome all along. "We need to talk," I said when I reached him, not a request, not this time, and something in his expression shifted just enough to tell me he recognized the difference, that this was not the same conversation we had yesterday, not the same version of me standing in front of him. He studied me for a second, then nodded once, a small acknowledgement that felt like permission even though I had not asked for it, and without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit, not checking if I would follow, because he did not need to, and that irritated me more than it should have, because he was right. I followed anyway. Outside, the city noise returned in full, but it felt distant, like we were moving through it without being part of it. And he stopped just far enough from the entrance that we were no longer in the flow of people, but not isolated either, just a space carved out by presence alone. "You wanted answers," he said, turning to face me, his tone the same as always, calm, controlled. But there was something else there now, something more direct, like he was no longer deciding whether to engage, but how much to reveal. Then ask the right questions. And for a moment, everything I had planned to say, everything I had rehearsed in my head during a sleepless night, felt smaller than the reality of standing here, because this was not just about understanding what he had done, it was about understanding why he had chosen me at all, and whether that choice was something I could ever walk away from once I fully saw it. Why me? The question came out before I could soften it, before I could turn it into something safer, because that was the only thing that mattered now. Not the car, not the messages, not the quiet ways he had rearranged parts of my life without asking, but the reason behind it. The reason he had looked at one moment in the rain and decided it was enough to change everything that came after. He did not answer right away, and for a second, I thought he might avoid it, might redirect again the way he had before, but instead he held my gaze like he was weighing how much I was ready to hear, and that alone told me this was not simple, not something that could be explained in one sentence and forgotten. "Because you did not hesitate," he said finally, his voice quieter now, not softer, just more precise, like each word had been chosen before he spoke it, and I frowned slightly, because that did not feel like enough, not for everything that had happened since. "That is not a reason," I replied, shaking my head, refusing to let him reduce it to something that small. But he did not argue, did not correct me, just took a step closer, not enough to crowd me, but enough that the space between us felt intentional again, like every inch was measured. "It is, in my world," he said, and there it was again, that difference, that invisible line between the life I understood and the one he moved through so easily. And for the first time, I realized this was not just about me stepping into his world, it was about him pulling something from mine, something he had decided was worth keeping. "Most people calculate," he continued, his eyes never leaving mine. "They weigh the risk, they look around, they decide whether it is worth it, and most of the time, they walk away." And I felt something tighten in my chest, because I knew he was right. I had seen it myself, people choosing distance over involvement, safety over inconvenience, and I had always told myself that I would not be like that if someone needed help, I would stop, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it was inconvenient. But I had never thought that choice would matter to someone like him. "You did not," he said, and the way he said it made it feel less like an observation and more like a conclusion he had already reached, something final, something that could not be undone. I crossed my arms again, not out of defiance this time, but to ground myself, to hold on to something familiar while everything else felt like it was shifting. "So that is it?" I asked, my voice quieter now, not because I was unsure, but because I was starting to understand that this was not a conversation I could win, not in the way I was used to. "I help someone, and you decide I am What exactly? He studied me for a second longer, and this time, there was no pause, no hesitation, just a simple answer that landed heavier than anything else he had said. Different, he replied, and the word hung between us in a way that made it feel larger than it should have, like it carried weight beyond its meaning, like it explained something I had never been able to name about myself, even before he said it. I let out a slow breath, looking away for just a second, not because I was intimidated, but because I needed a moment to process the fact that this was his reason, not power, not control, not anything I had expected, but a single moment, a single decision, seen through a perspective I did not share, and turned into something that reshaped everything that followed. You cannot just decide to change someone's life because of that, I said finally, looking back at him, holding his gaze the way he had held mine, because if this was going to continue, then it was not going to be one-sided, not anymore. For the first time, something in his expression shifted in a way I could not fully read, not amusement, not irritation, just something that acknowledged the weight of what I had said. And when he spoke again, his voice carried that same calm certainty, but there was something else there now, something that felt almost like honesty instead of control. I did not change your life, he said, and I almost interrupted him, almost argued, but something in the way he said it made me wait, made me listen to the rest. I gave it a direction, he continued, and the distinction should not have mattered as much as it did, but it did, because it reframed everything, not as something taken from me, but as something set in motion, something I could still choose to follow or not, even if the path itself had not been mine to create. I stood there for a second, letting that settle, letting the noise of the city fill the silence between us, and for the first time since this started, I realized something that changed the way I looked at him, not as someone controlling everything around me, but as someone who believed he was doing something necessary, something justified, even if I did not agree with it. And if I decide I do not want that direction? I asked, the question quieter than the others, but more important, because this was the line, the one that would decide whether I still had a choice in any of this. He did not look away, did not hesitate, just met my gaze with the same steady focus he had carried from the beginning. Then I will make sure you are still safe walking away from it, he said, and the words landed differently than I expected, not like a threat, not like a challenge, but like a promise, one that carried weight because of who he was, because of everything he had already done without asking. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, not because I understood everything yet, but because for the first time, I could see the shape of what this was becoming, not something forced, not entirely, but something offered in a way that did not require my permission to exist, only my decision to accept or reject it. And as I stood there, looking at him, I realized the most dangerous part was not the way he could change things around me. It was the fact that part of me was no longer sure I wanted him to stop,